cool. A Star Trek convention.
Melvar, can you give us some idea of how long this is going to last?
Until time stops.
You can't do this.
Now, we have a full schedule of events.
Can people who hate Star Trek leave?
Good question.
No, you have to stay even longer.
No.
All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another Classic Comics Trek Talk live stream. And hail to Gwagnar. Hello, sir. Thank you for being here as always. I appreciate you always checking in. Okay, so today, or this week rather, I'm going to be looking at Assignment Earth. So this is episode 55. I am going in production order, as always, not the order of broadcast, but production order. And hello, Rogues1138. Hello to you too as well. Thank you for stopping by. And as always, as I go through this, I'll be reading from Mark Cushman's book, These Are the Voyages, for behind-the-scenes information about the episode and the making of it. So, you know, as I think is pretty commonly known, this was essentially a pilot for another show. Star Trek was, this was the last episode made for the second season, and at the time this was being made, it was widely thought on the sets, you know, and in the offices of Star Trek that this was probably the last episode because they had not gotten a green light for a third season yet. And so, you know, it's an episode, it's neither fish nor fowl because it's not a full-fledged pilot for another show, you know, for Gary 7 or whatever that show was going to be called, but it's not really quite a Star Trek episode fully either. But it is still, I think, overall enjoyable. And honestly, after watching it, you know, after so many years of checking it again, I'm kind of like, yeah, it's a shame they didn't pick this up and make this a show. I think it could have been fun to watch. Okay, now this was written by Art Wallace and Gene Roddenberry and directed by Mark Daniels. So this is from an NBC press release issued on February 27th, 1968. The Enterprise crew returns to the 30th century to learn how the Earth survived 1968 and nearly witnesses the destruction of the world in Assignment Earth on NBC, Friday, March 29th. A 20th century man, Gary 7, who has been living on another planet, appears aboard the Enterprise and informs Captain Kirk that Seven's mission is to prevent world holocaust by stopping the United States from launching the first warhead. Kirk and Spock aren't sure if Seven is a friend or enemy and attempt to stop him. Roberta Lincoln, a 1968 secretary, is trapped between factions and becomes an unwitting threat to each. Divine intervention is the theme here. The guiding hand does not come from a god, however, but from alien beings and the human they have trained. And well needed in 1968 and beyond, the story delivers a warning about rushing into nuclear conflict, especially one that could end civilization. All right, so in 1968, there were no H-bombs in orbit around the Earth. And Rogue says, aliens live among us. Yeah, well, depending on who you believe, maybe they really do. In the early 1960s, H-bombs were being flown around the planet on board long-range, high-altitude jets. And some of them had been lost. There was one incident where an Air Force jet experiencing mechanical problems had been forced to jettison its payload of nuclear bombs into the sea. Roddenberry, a former war pilot and now a pacifist, feared it was only a matter of time before a true disaster occurred. And thus Star Trek made its most direct anti-armament statement yet. The story does not take place on an alien world, nor does it take place in the future. The what if was intentionally kept close to home. 1968 was chosen to force the audience into realizing that this danger, that this madness was already knocking at the door. To the credit of NBC, the storyline was approved. There was no resistance over Assignment Earth having only one villain, that being the U.S. military. The structure of the story is unique. The two opposing characters, Kirk and Seven, have a common goal but differ on how to reach it. All right, let me grab a drink of water right quick. Hold on. All right. So let's get into this one here. So we start off, and the Enterprise has time traveled back to the year 1968 to determine how Earth survived certain events that took place in that year. Now, this is one thing I question. They say, Kirk says they're using their deflector shields to prevent them from being detected by radar and that sort of thing. I didn't think that deflector shields worked that way. I mean, they're basically using it as what, a cloaking screen? I don't know. That didn't quite fully work for me, but oh well. Now, the ship then encounters some sort of turbulence. And Spock tells Kirk that they seem to have intercepted a transporter beam. And Kirk says that that is not possible, but Spock tells him that someone is now beaming onto the ship. Spock then tells Scotty that the transporter beam originates from more than 1,000 light years away, and Scotty says that's impossible. Transporters can't beam people that far, even in the 23rd century. So Kirk scrambles down to the transporter room to investigate, just in time to see a man materialize on the transporter pad. And a man holding a black cat, of all things. And of course, this is Robert Lansing playing Gary Seven. And this is certainly unusual. This was the first episode of Star Trek to have the guest star, or a guest star, being shown, their name being mentioned in the opening credits. That had never been done before. And this was written by Gene Roddenberry and Art Wallace. And I know it says teleplay by Art Wallace, but as I'll talk about when I get into it, Gene Roddenberry did do a rewrite of the script, so he co-wrote it as well. Okay, so this man demands to know why they have brought him aboard. Oh, and yes, and directed by Mark Daniels. Then he sees Spock and realizes that, he recognizes that Spock is a Vulcan and realizes that these people must be from the future. He insists that they beam him back to Earth immediately. Now, they ask who he is, of course, and he tells them that he is a human of the 20th century, but that he's been living on an alien world. He doesn't specify which one. And says that these aliens want Earth to develop safely, and he has been sent to ensure that we don't blow ourselves up, basically. He also says that by interfering, Kirk and the Enterprise are risking altering history and may even be endangering their own existence, but says he won't. Kirk says he won't let the man beam down without some proof that what he is telling is true. So Kirk tells security to take him to the brig, but then he tries to overpower the guards and fights them. And here's an interesting thing. So Spock tries to nerve pinch him, but it doesn't work. He's able to just shrug it off. And he must be pretty strong as well. He manhandles the two security guards and even manages to wrestle Spock off of him. Then he tries to, and there he's giving Spock the old karate chop. So then he tries to activate the transporters. Kirk stuns him. Then he has security haul him away, and he tells McCoy that he wants to have McCoy examine this guy and determine if he is really human. Now, later in the conference room, Kirk and Spock discuss this stranger that they've encountered. Spock notes that there are a multitude of crises that are about to occur on Earth, including a high-profile political assassination, a military coup in Asia, and the U.S. is about to launch an orbital nuclear missile platform in response to other nations, presumably the USSR, that have already done so, which will move the world dangerously close to a nuclear confrontation. Now, Kirk then makes an announcement over the intercom system. And this was interesting. So we see a couple of crewmen walking in the hallways as this announcement is being made. And of course, the guy on the right here, this is Gary Paskey, who I've mentioned before, and he's usually on the bridge playing Lieutenant Kelly, who is a red shirt. But here we see him in Command Gold, and it's interesting because we'll see him again as another character in this episode. In fact, in the very next scene here we go. I'm pretty sure this is him as well. I'm not entirely sure, but I think that's maybe him playing an engineer tech down in engineering with Scotty. Okay. And Scotty, let's see. So basically, Scotty says that they've tracked the transporter beam, or tried to, but they can't really determine where it's from. And Scotty says this beam is so powerful, it could be from 1,000 light years away. It could be from the future. He could have beamed back into the past from the future for all we know. So basically, there's no real clue as to who this guy is. And Rogue says, what a way to cut costs. Yeah. Now, in the brig, so this guy who eventually will learn that his name is Gary 7. He produces basically a sonic screwdriver. I mean, that's not what he calls it, but that's what it is. It seems to be disguised as a metal ballpoint pen. He takes it out, but it's like the sonic screwdriver the Doctor uses. It's some sort of multi-tool, some sort of alien multi-tool. And he uses that to short out the force field on his cell, and then he uses it to zap the security guard. And this has the effect of making the security guard very kind of mellow and and relaxed. And then Gary 7 basically just tells him, you're tired, go to sleep. And the guy just drops to the floor and goes to sleep. Now, in the conference room, McCoy tells Kirk and Spock that the stranger's body does appear to be human, but he finds it odd because his physiology is almost too perfect. There's no flaws that he can find in him at all, leading them to think that maybe this is some sort of manufactured human body and that therefore this may be some sort of alien masquerading as human. Now, before they can say any more, then the security sounds an alert that the prisoner has escaped, and Uhura tells Kirk that someone is using the transporter. And as they're talking about this, the cat, which Spock had been holding, makes a getaway out of the conference room. Now, Kirk tells security, actually before that, then he is told that the transporter is being activated. Kirk orders that security stop the transporter, but it's too late. And he beams out before Kirk or security can stop him. So he then materializes in an office in New York City, emerging from what appears to be a vault behind a hidden door. He then activates a hidden computer in this office and tells it to locate 2 other alien agents that are already supposed to be at work on this planet. Now, the computer asks for more information regarding his mission. He identifies himself as Gary 7, and he explains that he's been sent to monitor Earth's technological progress and intervene to ensure that Earth develops into a peaceful society before it destroys itself. On the Enterprise, Kirk decides that he and Spock will follow him down to Earth. Spock notes that this is risky as they could inadvertently alter history, but is determined to do so anyway. And I know why they're doing it, because obviously Spock was a very popular character and he's like the main co-star, but does it really make any sense for Spock to go down? I mean, all that can happen is that he gets caught and people freak out because he's a Vulcan. Does it really make sense for him to be down there? Not really, but oh well. Okay. Now, meanwhile, Gary Seven's computer tells him about the orbital nuclear platform that's about to be launched. The computer tells him that the mission of the other two agents was to sabotage the launch of this rocket, but they have now vanished and the mission has not been fulfilled yet. So Gary decides that he must complete the mission and sabotage the rocket himself. Meanwhile, Kirk and Spock beam down, and with Scotty's guidance, they try to find Gary Seven. Now, Gary Seven uses this computer to manufacture a variety of false IDs for himself, showing himself to be a CIA agent, a homicide detective, and an agent of the NSA, among other things. And also manufactures a map of the rocket base, McKinley Rocket Base, which I assume is a fictional place where the rocket is going to be launched from. And of course, all the footage of the rocket is from Cape Canaveral. So then a young woman arrives at the office. Now, Gary Seven at first thinks that she is one of the missing agents and demands to know where she's been. And of course, she doesn't know what he's talking about. And eventually she gets upset and tries to leave. And he realizes that she's not just acting stupid or unaware. She really isn't an agent. And then asks who she is. Now, so he takes out this little green cube here and asks who she is, and it tells him that her name is Roberta Lincoln and that she was hired as a secretary by the other two agents. However, it's clear that she doesn't realize what they were really up to. She was told that they were working on research for a new encyclopedia. Hey, remember those? And she asks what they were really doing, and he shows her his CIA ID. Oh, yeah, and then, of course, he tells her to explain where she's been for the last few days. And she's about to type it, but then he activates some gadget and basically makes the typewriter go voice to text, and type out whatever she says. So then he shows her his ID, showing that he is with the CIA, and basically tells her that he's working for the government and, he's got important work to do here. And, kind of lays a guilt trip on her saying, don't you want to help your country? Don't you want to protect mankind and all this? And she's, yeah, okay, yeah, sure. And so he basically tells her to just act normal and do what she would normally do while he goes back in the office to consult with the computer some more. Let's see. Now, the computer tells him that the other two agents were actually killed in a traffic accident. And of course, he's very upset to hear this. Now, meanwhile, Scotty guides Kirk and Spock to Gary Seven's office. When they enter, Roberta demands to know who they are, and they get into a scuffle with her after she tries to call the police. And first she scuffles with Kirk, then Kirk hands her off to Spock. And of course, she knocks his hat off, and she sees that he is, not human. Now, the door to the inner office is locked, so Kirk zaps the lock in order to get in. Of course, Gary Seven has heard they're scuffling out there, so he activates his transporter. And, it doesn't work like the Star Trek, like the Starfleet transporter. You don't just stand in a pad. It's more like some sort of a portal. Again, there's a hidden door and, sliding door that opens up, and behind there's what appears to be a vault. You open up the vault, and then it's a portal, and you just walk into it and go where you want to go. And Kirk tries to stop him, but he's too late. And Gary Seven uses this to transport himself to the rocket base where the launch is about to take place. And so this is a bit of a slight thing. Again, I kind of question, because the two agents that were killed, hold on, let me take a drink of water right quick. Hold on. Okay. So the computer mentioned, yeah, they were killed in a car wreck. And the computer mentions that they were killed like just outside the rocket base. So it seems like they were on their way to the rocket base or were maybe casing it before they were killed. I mean, okay, but why did they do that? Why didn't they just, you know, why didn't they just teleport there? Why did they use a car when they could just teleport right into the base? It's kind of like a little bit of a plot hole there. I mean, it's not a big one. It's not a big deal. But still, it is one thing I kind of noticed, like, why did they use a car? They have a transporter. Okay. So Kirk finds the map and realizes, they realize that he's gone to stop the launch or to basically to meddle with the launch in some way. And while they're talking, the police arrive. And so they knock on the door, and then she screams for help. They try to, quiet her. So Kirk calls Scotty and tells him to, beam them up. And then the cops confront them. And then when Scotty activates the transporter, he beams all four of them up, back up to the Enterprise. And of course, the cops are stunned to find themselves, where they are. And then, of course, Kirk just tells Scotty, quick, beam them out. So they beam them back to the office. Now, meanwhile, Gary 7 is stopped by a security guard while he's. So this car here belongs to the launch control, like, manager or whatever. I forget it. There was a nameplate here, but unfortunately I cut it off when I put it into the PowerPoint here. So he's looking at this car when he is confronted by a guard. And this guard, he ties his ties like I do. His tie is way too short. It's like halfway down his belly here. And that's what always happens to me when I tie my ties. I always tie them too short. But he demands to know who this guy is. What are you doing here? And he produces his CIA ID, or actually, no, it was NSA, his NSA ID. And then the security guard says, hold on, I'm going to have to just call in and check on this and verify it. Then the cat, so he puts his cat down, and the cat distracts the guard long enough for him to pull out his little sonic screwdriver and zap the guy. And again, kind of makes him all mellow. And then he takes him behind a dumpster and tells him, go to sleep. Go to sleep, go to sleep, go to sleep. And he does. Now, later, the launch control coordinator, he comes out and gets into his car and drives out to the gantry for a final inspection before the launch takes place. Now, back on the Enterprise, they're trying to locate Gary 7 with their sensors. And at this point, Kirk mentions that it's about 40 minutes until the launch. But they can't locate him. Now, the launch control coordinator arrives at the gantry, and then he and some security men go to, again, do a sort of final look over and inspection of everything to make sure everything's okay. And then we find that Gary 7 has stowed away in the trunk of the car. Presumably, he used his sonic screwdriver thingy to open the trunk. Now then, they are satisfied with their inspection, and they leave thinking everything's fine. He comes out of hiding and then takes an elevator up the gantry. Now then, Scotty beams Kirk and Spock down to the launch center, and you think they would have put them in some area that's kind of out of the way. But no, he beams them because this is like the launch control center right here. And this is like the launch control. And he literally beams them in right on the doorstep. And by this time, the security guard has recovered. So he gets the drop on them. And so they're captured. Now, let's see, where was I? Yeah, so Gary 7, he gets onto the gantry and gets access to the rocket's circuitry, and he begins altering it to change the rocket's flight path. And Kirk and Spock are taken prisoner, and of course it's what you expect. It's what are you doing here? Who are you people? What are these gadgets? What do they do? Et cetera, et cetera. Okay, and then here, again, Scotty is trying to locate Gary 7. Now he finally gets a lock on Gary 7, locates him on the gantry, and then we see him with a couple of texts, and again, we see Eddie Paskey here, but now he's back in red again, as I guess he's a security guard. Presumably that's Lieutenant Kelly now. I don't know. And this, of course, is setting all aside the fact that I think Lieutenant Kelly died a few episodes back anyway. So he's died at least once on this show already. Okay, so then Scotty locks the transporter onto Gary 7 and beams him out. But as this is happening, Roberta back in the office accidentally activates the mechanism that opens up the portal and reveals it. And then it's got some controls on it. So she starts just kind of tampering with them and actually activates it and manages to pull him away and back to the office at the last moment. And he realizes what happened, that, he had been beamed to the Enterprise and then pulled away back to the office. And he's upset as he had not finished doing his sabotage work yet. So he turns on the view screen to watch the launch. And at this point, Roberta realizes something is up. She says, not even the CIA can do all this stuff. Now, Gary asks the computer if he can still alter the rocket's trajectory, and it says he can do it manually using the X-Seaver, or whatever the X-Seaver is. So the rocket launches, and we see some of this footage, which I think we've seen in lots of stuff over the years. I was actually born in 1968, the year this aired. And of course, this is footage of the first Saturn rocket launch, and this was Apollo 4, I believe. And I've seen this kind of footage, and I'm sure a lot of us had it in a lot of different things over the years. Plenty of documentaries or news footage, in various movies that cover, like maybe the space program, like The Right Stuff, as well as sci-fi shows. One thing I always think, there's MTV, MTV, that kind of ad promo they would run with the rocket, and then they'd show the guy on the moon and the flag and everything, that used this stuff. And I always think of the video, for Major Tom by, what is his name, Peter Schillinger or whatever it was, that made use of this footage, particularly this footage here of this second stage breaking away and falling back to Earth. It's just really iconic in a way. Now, Roberta tries to call the police, and he zaps the phone to prevent her from calling, because at this point she's thinking, he's some sort of enemy agent or something. And he tells her not to try leaving as all the doors are locked. Now, he arms the missile in preparation to detonate it. But Roberta, and at this point, the people on the ground realize that the missile is armed. So while they're distracted by all this going on, Kirk is tries to get the communicator and call the Enterprise. The security guard stops them, but he did activate it. And so it emits a signal. Now then Roberta whacks Gary 7 over the head to try and incapacitate him, and she grabs his little sonic screwdriver and threatens to shoot him with it. She pleads with him to let him complete what he's doing, warning her that, if you don't let me do this, then it's going to start World War III. Meanwhile, Scotty locks in on the communicator signal and he calls the communicator. The security guard hears this and, of course, is confused by who he's talking to. So while he's distracted, Spock nerve pinches him. Kirk grabs their phasers and communicators, and right quick, they beam away. And even though this is literally happening like 3 feet behind them, the other people don't notice it. Admittedly, they're worried about a nuclear missile because at this point they know the missile is on a trajectory to hit Asia. So the Soviet Union probably, and maybe start World War III. So admittedly, they're a little distracted. Okay. Now, Kirk and Spock beam into the office, and Kirk tells Spock to try and destroy the missile, but he is not familiar with the operation of Gary Seven's computer. And Kirk asks, can you destroy this thing? Can you figure out this computer and detonate the missile, in time? And Spock says, I don't know. I'm not certain. And eventually Kirk relents and he lets Gary Seven step in and take over. And he detonates the rocket in the atmosphere at the last moment, preventing it from starting a nuclear war. Now, later, Gary is basically doing a log entry. And again, he's using the sort of text to voice to text feature on this typewriter, cataloging the events of his most recent assignment. While he's talking, Roberta looks over at a sofa at the Black Cat at ISIS. Now, then Kirk and Spock explain that they've checked their history records. And according to their historical records, events played out as they were supposed to, because history records that that missile did go off course and it did detonate in the upper atmosphere. And then Kirk and Spock explain, honestly, a little bit smugly, if I may say, that, they didn't interfere with anything. Events just happened as they were supposed to. And, of course, my question to that is, well, if you changed history, wouldn't that maybe be reflected in your historical records, that the historical records would change to reflect the changed history? So does that really prove that things happened the way they were supposed to? I don't know about that. I find the logic there a bit faulty. So Roberta looks back over at the couch and now is stunned to see that instead of a cat, there's an attractive young woman sitting on the couch. And she then turns to Gary Seven and demands to know who is that? And she points at the couch, and Gary Seven says, "Oh, that's my cat." So she looks back over at the couch, and it's a cat again. And then Kirk and Spock observe that they've also looked at other events that are coming up in the near future, and they observe that Gary and Roberta have some interesting adventures ahead for themselves. And then they beam out, and it ends there. And so, overall, it's kind of a fun episode. I wouldn't say it's a great one. I'd grade it a C+. As I said at the beginning, it's because, I would say, honestly, overall, I would say that it's actually like a B, maybe, or a B- at least. But as a Star Trek episode specifically, I got to dock it because for much of the episode, our main stars are kind of sidelined while Gary Seven and Roberta are taking up most of the plot. Not bad, but again, it's supposed to be Star Trek, not Assignment Earth. I would have watched the Gary Seven series, says Rogues. Yeah, I mean, it's a shame that show didn't get picked up. And I'll talk a little more about that as I go through the behind-the-scenes stuff here. All right.
Cool.
Hold on. I didn't mean to hit that one. There we go. Here we go. All right. So, Dark Horse. Yeah, I knew there were some comics. I didn't remember if it was Dark Horse or who did it. And again, one of the things rewatching this episode, because this is the first time I've seen this episode in a long time. And I was struck by how much this episode, if Assignment Earth had been picked up, how much it kind of feels like it would have been almost like an American version of Doctor Who. Because, and I don't know for a fact that Gene Roddenberry or Art Wood were influenced, or Art Wallace, excuse me, were influenced by Doctor Who, but it certainly does feel that way. You got a guy from outer space who comes to Earth and he helps solve various crises. He has a pretty attractive young female assistant, and he has a sonic screwdriver, of course. He doesn't have a time machine, but he does have an office that has all these hidden compartments. So in a sense, it is bigger on the inside than it looks like, right? And he does employ alien technology. So I've seen, I actually found the other day a YouTube video of someone who did a kind of like credit sequence for an Assignment Earth series, if one had ever been done. And it's actually pretty good. I liked it. I don't remember the channel, though. All right. Assignment Earth was designed as a pilot for a new series. Each week, Gary Seven, assisted by Roberta Lincoln, would be on a mission to save Earth from itself. Robert Lansing, for a 1989 interview with Starlog, said, quote, "What Gene had done was go to futurists and scientists and ask them what advanced societies out in space might do toward more primitive societies like ours. One of the futurists said that they would probably abduct children from various planets, take them to their superior civilization, raise them and teach them and enlighten them, and then put them back as adults to guide their worlds in more peaceful ways. That was the idea behind Gary Seven." Hold on just a moment. All right. Roddenberry toyed around with his concept of a man taken and then returned to Earth in order to save humankind from itself in a series of story outlines that were written in April of 1965. And Rogue says, reads like an Ancient Aliens episode. I mean, I guess, kind of. I guess you could see it that way. Let's see. So a rough script called Seven was distributed to a select few in the Star Trek offices on November 14th, and at Desilu as well, I think, in November of 1966, for the purpose of setting a budget and attracting a star. So, this isn't something that came late. This was something that was in the works before Star Trek was even airing episodes. Now, at this point, the characters of Star Trek were not involved in the script in any way. It was a completely separate story. On November 16th, Roddenberry polished his teleplay, and then on November 20th, he sent a letter to Lloyd Bridges of Seant fame, in which he wrote, "I just completed a pilot script, an unusual half-hour of drama and comedy, which kind of excites me per the chat we had about such things, and I'm immediately air-mailing you a copy unofficially." Roddenberry wanted to attach a star before approaching the network with the concept, and was hoping that the Lloyd Bridges, who he had already approached about playing Captain Kirk and who had said no, would now agree to play Gary Seven. Bridges, however, was uninterested in anything that might be perceived as juvenile and politely declined after reading Roddenberry's sketchy script. Roddenberry next took a pitch meeting with the programming and development executives at Desilu. The studio liked the concept well enough to take it to NBC Burbank. A short while later, Roddenberry learned that his friend and a veteran Star Trek writer, Art Wallace, had also taken a pitch meeting at NBC with an idea for a series that he called Space Cop. Interviewed for Starlog in 1986, Art Wallace said, quote, "They had said that Gene had come up with a very similar idea to the one I had about a man from tomorrow who takes care of Earth's present." In a June 14th, 1967 memo to Herb Solow, Roddenberry said, quote, "He reports that they are quite interested in this idea and wants to know whether we want to pursue a joint development or whether we prefer to go it alone. I think we owe Wallace an answer on this one." So Wallace later said, "So I saw Gene and we decided to pool our ideas." And so this actually became kind of a combination of Roddenberry's idea and Art Wallace's. On August 16th, Roddenberry wrote to Herb Solow that he and Wallace had talked earlier in the day and would get together to rough out a story during a trip Roddenberry was taking to New York on the 30th of that month. Let's see. Okay, now on October 21st, Roddenberry and Wallace finished their outline for a pilot spinoff. And at this point, the characters from Star Trek were added in. Now, the spinoff was still a relatively new concept in television. Steve McQueen's, and this is some interesting stuff because I didn't know this. So Steve McQueen's series, Wanted Dead or Alive, was the first TV spinoff, spinning out of Robert Culp's TV show Trackdown, a Western, in 1958. Then in 1960, a show called Pete and Gladys spun out of another show called December Bride, which I'd never heard of. And here's another thing I didn't know. The Andy Griffith Show was a spinoff spinning out of an episode of the Danny Thomas Show. Now, the Danny Thomas Show was, I think, one of those comedy variety shows, I think. And so I'm guessing this started out as a skit that they were doing on the Danny Thomas Show and then was popular enough it got its own show. And, of course, the Andy Griffith Show was a big hit and got a few spinoffs. The first and biggest one, of course, being Gomer Pyle, USMC, which was actually the show that was absolutely dominating Star Trek on Friday nights during the second season. And what else? There was also Mayberry RFD. And I think there was at least one other. Does anyone remember? I think there was at least one other spinoff from the Andy Griffith Show, but I can't remember what it is. The year after that, Green Acres spun out of Petticoat Junction, and The Man from U.N.C.L.E. got a spinoff, The Girl from U.N.C.L.E. And another show, Burke's Law, got a spinoff, Honey West. The year after that, Assignment Earth was being planned, Patrick McGoohan, having already moved his secret agent character John Drake from the half-hour Danger Man to the 60-minute secret agent, and now taken on a similar spy with a conscience role in TV's first miniseries, The Prisoner. TV's biggest spin-offs were yet to come, but the formula was now in place. On November 8, 1967, Roddenberry received the go-ahead from NBC and Paramount to proceed with his plan to shoot the final Star Trek episode of the season as a backdoor pilot. Robert Justman, he had some, and because he was one of the execs at Desilu, he had some qualms about the whole thing, primarily because Gene Roddenberry was working with Art Wallace on the teleplay. Now, Art Wallace, he wrote Obsession, the episode, where Kirk is wanting to find and destroy this cloud creature that he believes is the same one that killed a lot of the crew on the Farragut years earlier, which was earlier this season, back around the middle of the season. And Justman was concerned because he, in a memo to Roddenberry, basically said, as I recall, that script had a lot of problems and needed a lot of work. And so he was kind of concerned with working with Art Wallace again. Now, if the network didn't exercise its option for an additional 1 or 2 episodes, then the production was planned to wrap for the season on January 3rd of 1968 with show number 26. But 2 additional scripts had to be on hand, nonetheless, just in case NBC wanted a full season of 28 episodes. The 2 scripts held in reserve were Dan Harlean's Shoal and Norman Spinrad's He Walks Among Us. As for Assignment Earth, the final episode to be produced for the season, be it episode 26, 27, or whatever, Paramount had yet to decide if it would allocate additional money beyond the normal Star Trek per episode budget due to Star Trek, even though pilots typically get bigger budgets. On December 12, 1967, regarding the revised draft by Art Wallace, Dorothy Fontana wrote to Roddenberry telling her boss, quote, "I find the story material very timely due to the recent headlines regarding the Soviet capability to orbit a warhead, and I believe the audience will also identify with the plot and theme because of this." However, Fontana was also personally disturbed and disappointed to see so many story ideas from previous Star Trek episodes being recycled. Particularly, she cited direct scene lifting from shows such as The City on the Edge of Forever and Tomorrow is Yesterday, which she had written. Fontana pleaded, please consider changes. And yeah, there are definitely, particularly with Tomorrow is Yesterday, because again, like that episode, they go back to what was the present at the time. And, we get stuff like, confusion. We get fish out of water stuff and confusion because they're not knowing how everything works. Members of the Enterprise, particularly Kirk and others, get arrested by security on a military base. Individuals get, beamed up to the Enterprise accidentally. And of course, which makes for a bit of humor and all that. And of course, we'll see that again. Or, well, not that, but see something similar in Star Trek IV. Robert Justman's concerns had more to do with the budget. He wrote, quote, "On page 19, we establish how the book-lined wall separates to disclose the computer panel. As presently constituted, we would have to platform this set to accomplish the action indicated. I would prefer that we come up with something just as clever but less expensive." This was one budget-cutting suggestion from Justman, which Roddenberry ignored, as he wanted to have his sliding bookcase platform and all. Roddenberry stayed in close contact with Wallace, and on December 2nd, sent his collaborator 9 pages of script notes. The next day, 9 more. The day after that, Roddenberry sent a memo to Stan Robertson at NBC requesting permission for the Enterprise. So what Roddenberry wanted to do is, at the beginning of the episode, when we first find out that they're in orbit around, modern day Earth, Uhura would say, I assume it would be Uhura, would say, "Sir, I'm picking up a transmission." And then Kirk would say, "Put it on the screen." And then it would turn out to be an episode of Bonanza, which was like NBC's top show at the time. Now, David Freeman of NBC wrote to Roddenberry on December 15th saying that everyone at the network and on Bonanza loved the idea of having the Western show up on the view screen of the Enterprise. But even a few seconds of the Bonanza clip, even if just a few seconds were used, then because of various like guild rules, if they used this episode, well, then they were going to have to pay the actors who are shown on screen. They'd have to pay the writer, they'd have to pay the director, etc. So there was going to be all these additional costs. And because of that, they dropped the idea and didn't do that. On December 20th, Roddenberry did a light polish on Wallace's latest draft and sent the material to the Mimeo department as the first draft script for the network. This was then forwarded to DeForest Research for coverage. Now, Joan Pierce, speaking on behalf of DeForest Research, wrote back on December 22nd, picking a bone over the story element having the United States firing nuclear warheads into space. She said, quote, "This would constitute a deliberate violation of the United States by the United States of the newly signed, as of January 1967, Treaty for the Peaceful Exploration of Outer Space, which contains a specific prohibition against nuclear weapons in orbit. To dramatize such an event could bring serious repercussions from the United States government and might lead to the end of NASA's cooperation. Now, of course, a lot of this was going to take place around, of course, a rocket launch, and they used a lot of stock footage that was supplied by NASA. And of course, there was concern if we offend them, they may not let us have the stock footage. And of course, if they do that, we're going to have a problem with, how are we going to do this episode? To change it, however, would completely gut the script with too little time left to rewrite it and to rewrite a new one. Roddenberry, and a rare occurrence of going against the advice of DeForest Research, stuck with the story he had, thereby risking alienating the U.S. government and NASA. And as for Star Trek, should it continue, and for Assignment Earth, should it make it to series? Roddenberry was under no obligation to share notes from DeForest Research with the network, which is an interesting wrinkle. So Roddenberry chose to keep this warning from DeForest Research quiet and didn't tell NBC about it. And he had a reason for being secretive. Roddenberry had been down this road before, and with bad results. His previous series, The Lieutenant, had actually been lost because of his determination to tell a story that the Pentagon didn't like. In an episode of The Lieutenant called To Set It Right, basically it was an episode that dealt with racial prejudice in the military. And the Marine Corps allowed the lieutenant, pretty extensive access to Camp Pendleton in California for filming of the show. And when they got the script, the Marine Corps had issues with the script. Roddenberry put it into production anyway, without changing anything, jeopardizing the endorsement of the Marines and risking losing Camp Pendleton and all the access it offered, and as well as a lot of other stuff, as sort of the use of troops, uniforms, buildings, vehicles, and armaments as part of the filming. Now, NBC, in an effort to appease the military, decided against airing To Set It Right, and also refused to pay a licensing fee to MGM, who were the makers of the series. Roddenberry, determined not to be censored, brought in the NAACP to put pressure on the network to reverse its decision and allow To Set It Right to be aired. He later boasted they lowered the boom on NBC. Now, this part is a little confusing to me. According to the book, there are discrepancies in the records as to what happened next. Most sources say that NBC buckled and aired the episode on February 22nd, 1964, but others state that To Set It Right was never aired. So we don't even know for sure if that episode aired. How is that possible? What is known is that the Marine Corps subsequently withdrew its endorsement of the series, and Camp Pendleton was no longer available to them for filming. Despite satisfactory ratings after losing the stamp of approval from the Marine Corps. And also, of course, at that point, they would have to build, lots of sets and lots of uniforms that the Marine Corps was letting them use. And I guess the NBC just didn't want to go to that trouble, so they canceled the show, leaving MGM with 29-hour-long episodes, which were too few to get into syndication. As a result, the studio disassociated itself from its maverick writer-producer, forcing Roddenberry to take his next creative property, Star Trek, elsewhere. Remarkably, having been burned once, Roddenberry was now playing with fire again. On Tuesday, December 26th, the Omega Glory wrapped, and for 6 days, the Star Trek stages were dark. During this time, Art Wallace was out of town for the holidays, and Roddenberry rewrote the script for Assignment Earth, which, again, as I mentioned, he basically co-wrote it, but he didn't get a credit. But he would get a producer's credit, which I'll get into here shortly. Now, on Saturday, January 6th, 1968, at the halfway mark of the production, as cast and crew were resting, Art Wallace wrote to Gene Roddenberry, basically voicing disappointment because he had read the script that Roddenberry had rewritten and was disappointed that it wasn't the script that he himself had written. But basically, he understood that because of budget and various other things, Roddenberry had to make changes. Art Wallace was well paid for his work on the script. Since this was a pilot, he earned $14,000 plus residuals instead of the going rate of $4,500. Even with this fat paycheck, Wallace ended his association with Star Trek here. He had mostly worked in daytime serials, and at the time, he was actually also working as a story consultant for All My Children. And he would go on to co-create Dark Shadows. And he would also continue to freelance for primetime shows, including 2 science fiction series. He would write episodes for Planet of the Apes and Space 1999. On November 15th, although he was still hoping to persuade Lloyd Bridges to take the role of Gary Seven, Roddenberry was also considering Patrick McGoohan and other actors, as well as Patrick O'Neill, Tony Franciosa, Burt Reynolds. It'd be interesting to see how that would work, and Robert Lansing for the league. Yeah, I can't see Burt Reynolds doing this. I can't see him doing this. On December 3rd, Roddenberry received word from NASA that footage of rocket launchings and General Cape Kennedy stock footage would be provided to Star Trek. This footage is more historic than most people realize, as it documents the preparation and launching of the first Saturn V multi-stage rocket, which was used for all the Apollo missions. In fact, the capsule at the top of the rocket you see in the footage is Apollo 4. This was the first to make it into space. Apollo 1 through 3 never got off the ground. The images of the rocket separating and discarding its stages are breathtaking to this day. And let's see. Again, let me bring that footage back up. Yeah, there you go. Yeah, I do love that. I wouldn't mind having that as some kind of a poster on my wall or something. Now, the storage buildings at the rocket base were actually studio buildings on the Paramount lot. Let's go back there. Here we go. With NASA footage of Apollo rockets matted into the background above them. And a commendable example of detail, launch director Cromwell's car. Let's see. Yeah, there's a good shot of it. Appears to be an exact match to the car that's actually seen in some of the stock footage sequences taken at Cape Kennedy. There was also new footage shot at the Cape specifically for this sequence, or for this episode. It was during this period that Roddenberry zeroed in on his Gary Seven, which turned out to be Robert Lansing. Lansing said, quote, "At the time, Gene was a good friend, but I was a New York snob actor coming out to Hollywood. Many folks in my self-perceived position didn't do Star Trek because it was considered a kid's show." But Roddenberry was persistent, and finally Lansing relented. Just 6 days before the episode was set to film, on December 28th, Lansing signed a contract with a pay rate of $3,000. If Assignment Earth sold as a series, he would get a bonus of $7,000 for the pilot, with a guarantee of $7,500 for each new episode. This was a top dollar going rate for broadcast TV in 1967 and 1968. Robert Lansing, at 39, truly carried the status of a guest star. He had been a gainfully employed actor on the stage in New York in the early 1960s, then had worked steadily on television and film since 1956. He had already starred in 3 series, 87th Precinct in 1961, 12 O'Clock High in 1965, and The Man Who Never Was in 1966. Roddenberry knew Lansing from the unsold 1965 pilot film, The Long Hunt of April Savage, which Roddenberry had produced. And then, of course, we've got the other guest star here. If I can find her. There we go. Terry Garr won the role of Roberta Lincoln. She later said that Star Trek was her first big break as an actress. Her father, Eddie Garr, was an actor on the stage in New York with some film work. Her mother, Phyllis Garr, was a dancer who later became a costumer in television. Starting in 1963, young Terry was a bit player and a dancer in Elvis Presley movies. Thanks to an introduction made by her mother, she also got to appear in an episode of That Girl in 1965, but she was still struggling to make it in the business. Quote, a friend of mine in acting class told me that they were casting a guest role on Star Trek, which was in its second season and already a huge hit, Garr said. This role was supposed to spin off into its own series. It was going to be tough to get an audition. All the big agents were clamoring to get their clients seen, and my agent wasn't in that league. She was great at making calls, but not so good at getting them returned. Luckily, my friend knew someone at the studio and helped me get through the door. Even with this, Garr had little hope. Quote, I never thought I would get the part because I was still really just a dancer. Commercials and That Girl were small potatoes as far as this was concerned. Then I read the script and saw that in the first scene, my character was flustered because she was late. And I thought, well, I'm always late. I can do that. And after I did the reading, they asked me to come in for a screen test. I'd never done a screen test before. Now, the casting came down to two actresses. For the role of Roberta Lincoln. And one of them was Dawn Wells, who was famous for her role as Mary Ann on Gilligan's Island, which had just been canceled, and Terry Garr, who was an unknown. Of Wells's audition, Roddenberry's notes from the time reveal the following, quote, good actress, but nothing really special in looks. Ouch. Fans of Gilligan's Island and all those millions of teenage boys who had a crush on Mary Ann would disagree. Of Terry Garr, Roddenberry wrote, very interesting, a good quality, all of her own. Garr said, they cut my hair short and they put me in front of a camera. They had me turn in a circle very slowly, and then they would ask me easy questions like, what's your name and where were you born? I was overjoyed to be having a screen test. I didn't dare hope I'd get any further, but the next thing I knew, they were calling me to appear on set. I was dizzy with joy, and that dizziness helped me get into character, I guess. The day after Lansing was signed, just 5 days before filming was due to start, Garr inked her contract for $750 and was promised an additional $550 per episode should assignment Earth go to series. Lansing remembered, quote, she didn't have much experience then, but she had this kind of kooky personality that certainly worked, and Gene understood it and how to work with it. Quote, Gene got into everything, said Robert Justman about Roddenberry's hands-on approach to producing this episode. The sets, props, special effects, casting of actors, casting of a black cat, and costumes, especially costumes. The costumes worn by guest star and potential new series lead Robert Lansing were not a problem. He wore what any self-respecting alien visitor would wear, a Brooks Brothers suit and a sensible tie. But owing to Gene's odd taste in ladies' fashion, Lansing's co-star Terry Garr made a fashion statement that set back high couture at least several hundred light years. I watched resignedly as Gene, up to his usual tricks, kept costume designer Bill Tice very busy. Making a tuck there and a trim there. Terry understood the machinations of show business, having come from a performing family, so she didn't object when, just before her first scene was set to film, Gene went to work on her costume again. He kneeled down, rolled up her already scant skirt, and told Bill Tice, "It's too long, Bill." Terry rolled her eyes at this. Also in the cast was Lincoln Domain as Sergeant. Yes, let me bring him up here. There, that's this guy. He was 42. His familiar face was often seen on camera from 1961 through 1974, mostly in westerns. Morgan Jones played Colonel Nesvig. He appeared in over 100 films and television programs beginning in 1952. Now, Don Kiefer played Cromwell, the mission control director. Let's see if I can find a good one of him. There he is. He's the guy on the phone. He appeared as Don Hollis in the Twilight Zone episode It's a Good Life, which is the episode in which young Bill Mumy sends people he doesn't like into the cornfield. Kiefer is the guy who gets changed into a jack-in-the-box. Oh, and now here's a fun one. So, where... Okay, here we go. Let me find a good... Okay, I guess this is as good as I'm going to get. So we got two cops here. Now, one of them was this was Ted Gehring. He was 38, and he was early in a career that would see him play more than 150 roles in TV and film, including making an appearance on an episode of William Shatner's show T.J. Hooker. Now, the other younger cop here, this is Bruce Mars. And you might remember Bruce Mars. He played Finnegan in Shore Leave. He plays, let's see. So Mars said, quote, "I had known Mark Daniels from before from out in New York. He wasn't a good friend, but I had known him. I got a call from the casting guy at Star Trek. That was Joe DaGosta. And he said, 'Hey, Bruce, are you doing anything right now?' And I said, 'No.' And he said, 'Would you like to make a few bucks to feed your dog and pay your rent?' And I said, 'Absolutely,' because, man, at that time I was broke. I was working in construction and literally digging ditches to make ends meet. So I went in there for a day and made a few $100. And it paid the rent, and my dog Butch ate well for at least 2 weeks." Now, Victoria Vetri, let me skip ahead here. There she is. Victoria Vetri, seen far too briefly as Isis in human form, was 23. She worked steadily in television starting in 1962 through 1975 under the stage name of Angela Dorian. After appearing in a photo spread in Playboy as Miss September of 1967, Dorian changed her performing name to Victoria Vetri. She was hot off her appearance in that issue of Playboy when Assignment Earth was filmed. By the time the episode had aired, Vetri had been named Playmate of the Year for 1967. Sex sells and top billing in films such as When Dinosaurs Ruled the Earth and Invasion of the Bee Girls would follow. Okay, now here's another interesting little wrinkle. So throughout the episode, of course, the cat makes various noises and purrs and meows and stuff. So none of that stuff is actually a cat. Actress Barbara Babcock, who was previously on A Taste of Armageddon, and also did the voice of Trelane's mother in The Squire of Gothos, would provide two episode voices for this episode. She provided the voice for the Beta 5 computer, Gary Seven's computer, and she also voiced the cat. She said, quote, "They didn't want to use a real cat's voice because there was such a range of emotion that they wanted this cat to express. So that's why they picked a human being to do her, and that was lots of fun. To be hired to play an animal was one of the most exciting things of all." I don't know. I can imagine her like in the sound booth or whatever, doing all these cat noises into a microphone. And Bertel LaRue, who is often heard in Star Trek episodes, was back for this episode, this time as the voice of Mission Control. He was the studio announcer in Bread and Circuses and the broadcast announcer in Patterns of Force just a few episodes ago, and did the voice of the Guardian Forever in The City on the Edge of Forever. And he was I believe he was the control voice on The Outer Limits. And of course, Mark Daniels returned for this one. This was his 13th episode of Star Trek. So I kind of was looking at the numbers. So through 2 seasons, they've been 55 episodes. And he's done 13. So he had done nearly a quarter of all the Star Trek episodes himself, almost. All right. Now, after the filming of Omega Glory, the Star Trek stages went dark from December 25th, 1967 through January 3rd of 1968. While Roddenberry prepared his backdoor pilot, NBC had an option for 2 additional episodes, which would have brought the season order to 28, but chose instead to just stick with 26. John Meredith Lucas remained in the offices overseeing the editing of Omega Glory, while Robert Justman and his production personnel stayed busy working with Roddenberry. No one knew if Assignment Earth would close out the series. Anxiety in the Star Trek offices was high, but morale was also low. Production began on Tuesday, January 2nd, 1968. Now, whenever in the book, whenever they talk about the beginning of the filming, he'll always name off a series of like interesting historical notes of what was happening at the time, like what was happening politically, what were the top movies at the box office, what was at the top of the charts at the time, what were the top rated shows, all that. And I usually kind of skip that stuff because I don't want to get bogged down in it, but I thought I'd mention some of this. So the production began on January 2nd. So the day before, on New Year's Day of 1968, that was the day that Evel Knievel tried to jump over the fountains at Caesar's Palace, and failed and had that terrible wreck that really messed him up. And also on that day, the second heart transplant operation took place. The first heart transplant had been attempted about a month before on December 3rd of 1967, and that one had been a failure. And I assume that means the patient died. For the second attempt, the patient, it was a success, and the patient lived for 14 months. Now, Bijou Trimble, visiting the set with her husband John, recalled Robert Lansing was playing with the little servo mechanism that he carried in his lapel, his little sonic screwdriver thing, I guess. And he was just clicking it, going click, click, click. And the prop master, Irving Feinberg, walked over and said, "Don't play with that." And he took it away. Robert Lansing was the big guest star, and he looked over and said, "Can he do that?" And everyone said, "Yes, he can." Here's the thing, though extras and maybe even some of the guest stars made a little extra money by taking things. So there was a lot of theft on the set, I guess, especially the extras. They were adding a little to their income by stealing everything in sight. Star Trek fans visiting the set were often blamed for it, but it was mostly the extras. Mostly. Enjoying receiving the star treatment, Terry Garr said, "Star Trek was the first job where I had a fairly big part, speaking part. Up until then, I was just a dancer and I'd been treated like an extra. But suddenly everything was focused on me. As I read over my lines, one person was tugging my dress, someone else was combing my hair, and a third was doing my makeup. I realized that I wouldn't have a moment of solitude to get into character, that dealing with these distractions was just part of the job." Lansing recalled, she had a terrible time. Oh, yeah, let me see. Where is it here? Yeah, it happened so fast I couldn't get a really good image of it. So she had a terrible time with this bit where she was supposed to hit me over the head with a box and knock me out. And she was so nervous and reluctant to do it that finally I said, "Terry, just hit me." And she gave me such a clobber that she nearly did knock me out. Then Gene said it didn't look right and we had to do it again. Okay. Now, on days 3 and 4 of filming, at the end of this day, the company was 1/2 day behind schedule. Later that night, on Friday, which was the 4th, the Gamesters of Triskelion first aired on NBC. Fans watching at the time had no idea that the cast of their favorite show was in the midst of filming what everyone at Star Trek figured was probably the last episode. Again, Star Trek would come in second in its time period. Let's see. Day 6, they spent most of day 6 in the mission control room. Dorothy Fontana said, quote, "I think the greatest accomplishment we did on that was creating the mission control. That was a tough job because we had to bring in a lot of stuff. Normally, we tried to keep things manageable because we couldn't afford to bring in a lot or build a lot. But for that one, they were able to do a little bit more with the sets." Mark Daniels was not as impressed, saying, "We were simulating mission control, which on our budget was not easy. You had to make do with what you had." Lansing said, the fun with that show was working with the cats. We had 3 black cats. The cats would have a certain propensity. One would like somebody, one would want to would want to follow them around. So that day you would release the cat that would probably do what you wanted it to do. Bijou Trimble, however, remembered more cats than Lansing did, saying, quote, they had 7 black cats, all of which knew or could do one trick. Each one did a separate thing, and one was friendly enough to where you could pick it up and hold it, where the others would resist or start lashing their tails, which shows they're not happy. They had one cat that could walk across high beams, and that was the one that's with Gary Seven on the gantry. And they had the one that could be put on a couch, and believe it or not, that was the whole trick. You would put it on a couch, and it would just sit there and not move. Now, they had one that Spock held. Let's see here. Let me go back. There we go. They had one that Spock held, and they were ready to shoot, but the cat, it turned out, had a cold. Not Nimoy, but the cat did. And just as they were about to start filming, it turned its nose into Nimoy's chest and sneezed. And Nimoy sat there for a moment and then said, I have cat sneeze on my shirt. It was so funny because here is Spock saying something like cat sneeze. The cat wrangler was very proud of his cats because they all looked exactly alike in stature. You couldn't have told them apart. Lansing said, one of the cats took a great liking to me, and it was always loose on the set when I was working, so it happened that the stuff on the rock gantry was all largely ad-libbed. Go back here. Yeah, there you go. Where was I? Yeah, so it was all largely ad lib. I would say something like, ISIS, come on, you're getting in the way. You know, there's a bit of a hurry. This is not the time to misbehave. And we added little meows in later. Mark Daniels' only comment on the reasons for falling behind were, we had a cat featured in it, which is always a problem. Principal photography wrapped one day over schedule. The Star Trek cast was dismissed on Wednesday, January 10th, possibly for the last time. Okay, now I mentioned this was the first episode that had the guest star featured in the opening credits, which had never been done before. Another thing with this episode is that this was the first and only Star Trek episode to not credit a studio executive as being in charge of production. Herbert Solo, who had been doing it from the beginning, had now left Paramount Television, and Douglas S. Kramer, who would come in season 3, hadn't been hired yet. Even as the making of Assignment Earth was winding down, the battles were not yet over. Roddenberry had to fight for his sole producing credit, even though it was acknowledged that he had been more involved than normal and had in fact provided substantial services. It was assumed by the studio and probably by John Meredith Lucas as well that Lucas would share in the credit. And I guess being co-produced. But Roddenberry had other ideas. On January 15, 1968, Robert Roddenberry wrote to Emmett Lavery at Paramount's Legal Affairs Department. I produced Assignment Earth. My services were not substantial, they were total. And I think if you will check with John Reynolds, the president of Paramount Television, you will find that I worked closely with him and Leo Pepin, of Paramount's TV production supervisor, in actively and totally producing the show, services which were continuing at this date and necessarily will continue until a final print is ready for delivery to the network. Insofar as John Meredith Lucas goes, he was necessarily retained on staff until last week, since he had produced up through episode number 25. Roddenberry would get his production credit and his pilot and get Robert Lansing, but he would not get a series. When the final post-production bills were paid, the total cost of Assignment Earth was $193,495. A larger than usual part of the budget went to the writers. All right. So in the ratings, it did pretty standard for what Star Trek was doing in the second season. It came in second to Gomer Pyle, which dominated as usual. Star Trek got a 26.1% audience share, slightly ahead of Operation Entertainment at 23.3 and behind Gomer Pyle at 45.1. And that was for the first half hour. In the second half hour, it did slightly better at a 27.7 audience share, but it was still second place. So many things would change in the next few months. Assignment Earth did not go to series. The air date Justman had reserved for it to bump a repeat of the Deadly Years on September 6th of 1968, then became unavailable when the network decided to air a football game in prime time, the Cincinnati Bengals versus the San Diego Chargers. Justman shuffled the rerun schedule and fitted Assignment Earth in on August 9th instead, followed by the Deadly Years on August 16th. The second season episodes to miss out on getting an encore network airing were Friday's Child, Obsession, Wolf on the Fold, Patterns of Force, and Bread and Circuses. Despite Assignment Earth failing to launch a series, it would launch a star. Hold on. There we go. So Terry Garr, she would go on to have a pretty impressive career. She said, when I landed the coveted Star Trek part, I finally got real representation. Her new agent was at William Morris, the biggest talent agency in Hollywood. By the 1970s, as Assignment Earth was running in repeats over and over on hundreds of stations across America, Garr was starting to become a familiar face. That unknown actress on a Star Trek episode with the quirky way about her. One day, Terry Garr went with her mother to an Army surplus store to shop for jeans. She recalled how the dressing rooms were full, so she kind of half hid behind the stack of jeans and was about to shimmy into a pair of jeans to try them on when she was startled by a man who introduced himself as Charles Beard. Garr remembers, while I stood there in my underwear trying to play it cool, he walked up to me and said, "Hey, I saw you on Star Trek. You're a very good actress." But this wasn't just any guy. Chris Beard was actually a writer and producer on the Sonny and Cher Comedy Hour. And she soon landed a role on there, making some semi-regular appearances. Within a few years of regular TV employment, she began winning standout roles in big screen hits such as Young Frankenstein, Oh God, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, and The Black Stallion. I don't even remember her being in The Black Stallion myself. The 1980s would bring roles in plenty of other popular films, including Mr. Mom and Tootsie, for which she would be nominated for an Academy Award for Supporting Actress. Or at least I think it was supporting. Was it supporting? I think it was. Maybe it was lead. I may be wrong. Robert Lansing would never get another series as a star, but he did play a supporting character on 3 more shows. He would be a supporting character on Automan from 1983 to 84. And I didn't even remember that until they mentioned it. I was like, yeah, he was on Automan, wasn't he? And would also appear on The Equalizer in 1983 and 84, and then would also appear on Kung Fu: The Legend Continues from 1993 to 1994. Which I never really watched that. And I'm sorry, The Equalizer was in 88, 89. That's when that was. Bruce Mars, who had played Finnegan, was nearing the end of his acting career at this time. He says, quote, shortly after doing that in 1969, I became a monk. I had been meditating and was spiritually inclined for all those years while doing plays in New York and television in Los Angeles. And I decided that I wanted to give my life over to serving others and seeking God and just being as good a person as I could be. So Finnegan became a monk. Who knew? I didn't know. Okay, Dorothy Fontana said it wasn't the most successful Star Trek episode simply because it was geared to be a possible spinoff. You always have to sacrifice something when you do that, but it worked all right. I didn't have anything to do with it except for greatly admiring Robert Lansing, as I did at the time. Terry Garr was new to me, but I thought she was charming. But Lansing I had liked from his work on 87th Precinct. I had always admired his work, so I went down to the set a couple of times to watch him. Gary Seven was an interesting character. Robert Lansing said, quote, "It was a damn good script and a lot of fun," unquote. Art Wallace said, quote, "It was a very good pilot, and it's a shame because I think if they had done it as a series with just Gary Seven, it would have been a very successful show." Terry Garr said, quote, "I played Roberta Lincoln, a dippy secretary in a pink and orange costume with a very short skirt. Had the spinoff succeeded, I would have continued on as an Earthling agent working to save humanity in a very short skirt." In another interview, Garr said, quote, "Thank God that show didn't sell. Otherwise, all I would get would be Star Trek questions for the rest of my life." Bruce Mars said, "It's been 45 years ago." And this book was published in 2013 or 2014. So you're talking 20 years ago. Or, well, no, not 20, no, 10. So about 12 years ago, 12, 13 years ago. It's been 45 years ago, and I still get 5 to 10 fan letters every single month from people who were born only 20 or 30 years ago. Just the other day, I got an envelope in the mail with a couple of photos of Finnegan from a fellow who asked me to sign them. He was 17 years old, and he says that he and his friends watched the show on DVD, and he says, quote, "We say the lines along with you, but everything is connected. When something is meaningful, it just stays alive." So I'm guessing they scream, "Hit me, Jimmy, hit me." All right, so that'll do it for Assignment Earth, and that'll do it for the second season. All right, so I'm going to be with my National Guard unit this weekend, so I will not be doing a Trek Talk next week. So the week after, 2 weeks from now, I'll come back and I will do a recap review of the second season, just talk about the show and where it was at the end of the second season, where things stood, and then I'll talk about the fan campaign to save the show and get it renewed for a third season. And I'll also probably do a tier ranking of the show. I'm not clear if I'm going to try and do this all in one live stream or if maybe I'll try and split it up into two. I'm not sure yet. But then after that, I will likely have to take a hiatus again because I've started back with my graduate studies, and I will probably have to take a break for probably probably till late March or early April before I'll start up again. Let's see. So what else? Yeah, that is pretty much going to be it for now. I will do Earth's Mightiest Mondays with my friends Gary, my friends J-Man and Sean, looking at the original Avengers series. I'll still be doing that because, J-Man sets those up, so I just show up and talk. So they're easy for me to do. But that'll pretty much be it for now. Please do like the stream before you go. And sub to the channel if you haven't already. Catch some of my other videos. If you would. And let's see what else. Thank you to everyone who tuned in to watch during the stream and those who will catch it on a rewatch. And I'll see you all in 2 weeks. And until then, have a good night.